Speedrunning fans around the world, welcome back to the Pixel Perfect Marathon 3. We appreciate you tuning in, be it live here on Twitch, or if you're catching this on our YouTube videos on demand, please consider giving us a follow or liking and subscribing to know when more Pixel Perfect content goes live. My name is Eddie Joe, and I'm going to be your host till we close out the marathon today. We have some can't-miss games coming up, and you'll definitely want to stick around for the finale. Coming up, we have Leo Kidron with a TAS run of Trauma Center, Under the Knife 2. Then we'll close out our scheduled runs with Linkemeister running Sin and Punishment. Everybody, let's get hyped because we are ready for our next run. Actually, as I look over at our screen, I see that things are a little dark. I think what we might have to do is just take a quick second to remind everybody about why we are all here today. Pixel Perfect is a speed running and game showcase community. We're dedicated to hosting online events that bring video game entertainers and lovers from all backgrounds together to celebrate the video games that we love and the feats that we love to show off. Our team shares many years of organizational experience across various marathon communities, and our events are always open to runners of all experiences and abilities. It is an amazing place to be a part of, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity to be able to join you today. We're going to look to see if we can get this corrected. We'll take a very quick break, and then we will be right back. Welcome back, everybody, to Pixel Perfect Marathon 3. Hey, this is a live event, and you know what? Hosts are sometimes prone to making mistakes, and you know what? That's what we had here. That's on me. Leo is ready to roll. So you know what, everybody? Let's get hype. We are ready for that next run. He is an amazing Trauma Center speedrunner in his own right, and we saw him yesterday for day one's bonus run. Now, Leo Kidron returns to the PPM stage to treat us to a TAS run of Trauma Center, Under the Knife 2, normal difficulty. Take it away, Leo.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so yesterday we had the X-Ops All XS category. It was completed by TAS. This time we're doing the full game, which means kind of a few things to note is that we aren't going for anything in particular with certain grades or requirements. The TAS is just going as fast as it possibly can to get through the game. And that means a few things where it might not be logically make sense on watching it back. So I'll try and give some context here and there. So the main things to note is that we're doing surgery real fast, and I'll kind of explain it as once we get in. But because this is a tool assisted speedrun, everything is frame perfect. It's pixel perfect, if you will. Which means that it might go a little too fast to kind of appreciate at first. So I'll very quickly preface, the tools are on the left and right of the screen, and we're basically going to be operating in the center of the screen. That's the main thing. And you'll very quickly see how that all pieces together, but I'll get started, and I'll count us in for the RTA timing for the TAS, as normally TASs start from power on, from the first input. But we'll go by RTA for this one. So we'll get started, we'll get this disclaimer screen, and TAS is already mashing through all of these little splash screens here. But time starts the moment it hits yes, so that's going to be in 3, 2, 1, go. So we get a little disclaimer here, and immediately the TAS is just going to hit skip as soon as possible. And now we have a little bit of time to build up to the first operation. So something interesting that we discovered is, as with any kind of tool-assisted speedrun, you learn a lot about the game's fundamental mechanics on how things kind of work, how many frames are needed for minimum sort of actions, which most of the time isn't really relevant to a human, because you're not working in frames, you're working in usually, a couple hundred milliseconds at a time. And so it means that you're not really too worried about how many frames something takes. But it also means you can sort of see when can you do things as early as possible. And without tools like TAS Studio, which is what this was made with, it's hard to know. Anyway, first operation is we're going to be restructuring a leg. It's been broken and it's got some shards in, so we need to pull that all out. And so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to suture up some stuff. And that takes 1/5 of a second per suture. So if you blink, you're going to miss these 3 sutures. We're going to boost the vitals up to 80, as that's what's required to progress the operation. And we're going to slap some magical gel that heals up some more cuts and also disinfects the incision wound. And just like that, we're now already inside of the patient. We're going to pull out all of these shards. TAS does it so fast, it gets ahead of 2 dialogue boxes. And again, it does some more actions between dialogue that humanly isn't possible. It's a really small thing, but you'll notice that a bit of a trend where TAS gets ahead of itself, essentially. And there's even moments where the TAS has to slow down so it doesn't softlock itself. That's fortunately, it's not a huge problem in this particular TAS, but I've had issues myself with the first game in the series having to slow the TAS down, else the game can't keep up. So that was the first operation, and it was completed in 8 seconds. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how fast this is. Again, we have to skip through here. That's what's called an ESS, an episode select skip, where you open the episode, and because it has no operation to it, all you have to do is for the game to count as you clearing it, open it up, and you can then come out of the screen and go into the episode selection screen, which is ones where it shows your grade and how much time you spent on the operation. Now, chapter 1 is like a tutorial, essentially. It goes over basically how to perform surgeries. So the first one we had was the broken leg. The next one we're going to have is to do with tumors, which is actually surprisingly common in this game, of sort of dealing with more generic ailments. The first 2 games in the series were very much focused on the kind of strange, not alien, but kind of wild surgeries of guilt. This one has guilt, but it does definitely include a lot more normal surgeries, which is a nice take on gameplay. So, this operation, we get introduced to tumors as well as little polyps or mini tumors we have to laser. There's a small problem. Those mini tumors spawn blood sometimes, and we had to spend a lot of time figuring out when does that blood spawn? And that's called on by an RNG field. So there's a value in RAM that controls what the RNG seed is. And that's called every time the op is started based on the timestamp. To the second, not to the millisecond, fortunately, or to the frame, it's just to the second. Which kind of introduced to us the fact that there's not exactly an RNG manipulation, but if you can get to this op at an exact time, you know when the blood pools are going to spawn and where. And that's kind of the important thing. And so a lot of work was put into the TAS to essentially keep attempting this operation at certain timestamps to see what's the best result we can get. And you might have noticed there was a few blood pools there. It is possible to get the perfect RNG seed that prevents any blood from spawning. But the problem is, realistically, for the rest of the TAS, it would mean I would probably spend, instead of a month and a half, a month or so on making this, and putting 100 hours in, I probably would put in easily 300, 400 hours over the span of months and months. It's one of those things that we have an idea of it, but actually getting results out of it is incredibly difficult. And realistically, because there's so little information known about Trauma Center's sort of engine mechanics, the TAS here allowed us to sort of understand how certain things work on a more fundamental level. This op is we have to reconstruct the rib cage around the spleen, and so we get started off with a defib. We get to slide the boys in, and we'll do that, and then we'll get to deal with the actual surgery. And the main thing to note is TAS is going to do things with the same tool as much as possible. So it's going to first drain the blood, and then it's going to pull out all of the bone shards here. Just like that. And you can see, essentially, it's using each tool as much as possible, for it has to change. And that's a really important thing, routing-wise, not just for the TAS, but for human players as well, because changing tools takes time. In the case for the TAS, it takes 4 to 6 frames to change tools. And in a run like this, every frame counts. So if a frame can be removed here and there, even if it kind of seems a bit counterintuitive, if it's a frame, it saves a little bit of time. And that adds up across the entire run. There was a little bit of a delay there if you kind of look closely. That what happened was the TAS had to wait, because if it put down the last bone fragment too early, the game would just softlock and it wouldn't progress. And it was kind of the first documented softlock when I was making this TAS, because this game is generally a bit more stable. It's the sequel, so it's the second TS game. And interestingly enough, this wasn't, from my understanding, developed by Atlas. It was instead Atlas seeked and outsourced the work to a company called Vanguard, and they essentially did all the actual gameplay. And if you know anything about Trauma Center, this game, gameplay-wise, may feel very similar to Trauma Center New Blood, and that's because it was made afterwards. And the way it's is kind of like a port of the game. Not quite, but it's a lot of operations are very similar. Again, in this operation, the TAS is going to do things in a very particular order to reduce how much tool switching there is. Interestingly enough, something I observed and was sort of discovered to us and brought to our attention in the last year or so was putting the membrane down and gelling it earlier is considered better because of the animation times. So a small improvement that could actually be improved there is likely to gel that membrane super early. But it's a very small adjustment, and as mentioned previously, would save a very small amount of frames. And the main problem you have with a full game TAS like this is that any improvements, especially in the early game, could impact your results later in the run. So it ends up being a very messy process of testing changes in the early game, finding they work, but later in the game, any inputs you had just don't work, or even worse, you end up with a slower result despite saving a few frames earlier on. So TAS development is kind of an interesting and messy, complex process. It's not as just simple as put some inputs and see how early you can do them. There's a lot more that sort of goes on with optimization that isn't quite obvious. When I made this TAS, I streamed 75 hours of it, of the process, and it goes over. It's a pretty boring stream to watch, but it kind of shows a bit more of those steps and processes if you're curious, and that's available on my YouTube. So this next op is the first instance where we get to see some interesting choices by the TAS, because we haven't seen the TAS boost the vitals very much, because boosting vitals wastes time. Why bother doing it if the patient's going to live anyway? So let's see how that plays out for this operation. This patient has a fever, and it has some sort of blood pools under their skin. So we gotta cut those out, drain them, and then suture up the incision point, which is pretty straightforward, but it does cost the patient some vitals. We'll have to do that quite a few times. So you can see the TAS doing that here, draining up all the blood, suturing it up, and then you can see that process of cutting it, draining it, and suturing it all up. Now, Angie said to use the echo or the ultrasound. TAS isn't doing that because it knows exactly where everything is, because everything is predetermined, fortunately, in locations. We can see that patient's at 17 vitals and everything's getting so much worse. We get a star because plot, and very quickly the patient is going to nearly die. So if you're wondering why the patient isn't dead, the way the game works in terms of tool utilization, how much it's been used, as well as vitals, is there is a floating point value. So it stores a really big decimal number, which, as long as it isn't actually 0, the patient's still alive. So even if it's 0.000123, as an example, they're still alive. So we've got another ESS here, and then we'll move on to the second chapter. So a little more on the sort of floating point value. Normally that's not something you'll observe, because for most players, the vitals will kind of tick down a bit too quickly. But speedrunners as a whole will kind of teeter around that low vital mark, because as mentioned, boosting the vitals takes a long time. You have to select the syringe, then get a full syringe dosage and inject it, and that can take a long time. Even for the TAS, that takes over a second to fully complete. And while that gives 12 vitals, if you can not spend that time, it's even better. So speedrunners will regularly be at the very low vital mark, and TAS sort of takes that to the extreme of doing it nearly in every instance possible. There's only a few cases where vitals are boosted because it's desperately needed. This operation isn't much of an operation because we saw that star come up in the last operation. And that's because Derek is a holder. He utilizes the healing touch, where he concentrates really hard and draws a star, and then suddenly everything slows down. He becomes a human TAS, if you will. TAS doesn't need the healing touch, but it needs to complete this operation to progress. So it's going to draw a perfect star, and now it's going to draw a butterfly. And any time that we draw the healing touch going forward, the TAS is going to draw a butterfly. The context behind that was in our community, the star detection's a bit wonky, if you will. It's not perfect. And we have an entire channel dedicated to those very questionable stars that make no sense at all. But one of the community members discovered that you can draw a butterfly and it works. And so, interestingly enough, with the use of TAS Studio, I actually discovered that the reason why that works is because the way the star gets calculated internally, similar, if you were to draw it with sutures, it looks like a really wonky star instead of the butterfly. So that's why drawing a butterfly apparently makes a star. I think butterflies are way cooler, I'll be honest.
I'd agree with that, Leo.
Yeah. So when we had another marathon showcase of this game, anytime the healing touch was drawn, a butterfly was drawn instead, which is amazing.
So I got to ask really quickly, were there other symbols that you utilized prior to finalizing on the butterfly for the TAS run?
So there's a few interesting ones, like there's what we call the wireless router. It's just a bunch of lines that looks like a box with 2 antennae, which was very interesting. There's quite a few sort of variations of it, but I think I landed with the butterfly because it only spent a few frames in comparison to an actual star. So it's not the most efficient, admittedly, but for the sake of entertainment value, it was worth it.
Awesome.
So as I mentioned about the RNG, again here, you'll see these little tumors spawn, and the TAS has to laser those, and any blood is a waste of time by quite a few frames. So the less blood there is, the better. Now, human players would normally use the healing touch here to reduce how much vital loss there is, as well as that condition where you just saw the stomach kind of go this dark purpley color. That's called PGS, or post-guilt syndrome, and the TAS basically can just ignore it. And you can see that's a lot of blood, and the patient got very dangerously low in terms of vitals. But again, the same deal of, don't need to boost the vitals? Why bother? There was some boosting, and that's because there's a little bit of downtime. So, fortunately, the TAS sort of only really boosts the vitals unless it's absolutely necessary, or if it has nothing better to do. And that's kind of a common trend, even with human players. And you'll very quickly see how the TAS mimics human players in terms of how things are structured, because realistically, for when I developed this, I've got no other reference point than how me and a lot of other community members play this game. I'm sure there will be some kind of insane discovery down the line where we figure out that certain things can be done in absurd ways. But this TAS has already demonstrated quite a few of those, and you'll see that much later into the game, where kind of more absurd antics come up in terms of the camera, because this op introduces the camera tool. So it's basically just the ultrasound, but you can move inside of the organ because there might be multiple affected areas. So this one is, we have PGS again, post-kill syndrome. We've got to inject that syringe of black serum just to make it go away, and that's just to progress. Normally, TAS just doesn't care about that. Again, we don't need the healing touch because the TAS is essentially just acting as if it has the healing touch all the time. So we get some pus here, which is basically a way for the game to introduce inflammations if they're left too long. You might have noticed suddenly the tumors just kind of all appear at once. Again, same deal, TAS can cut these out, and as long as the cutting distance isn't too far across the organ, you don't get a cut in the patient. It's kind of specific distance, but it can mean the TAS doesn't have to waste frames with lifting the touch input. Very minor things, but they all kind of add up, and that's generally what makes I'd say TAS runs impressive. It's not the fact that it's just insanely fast, it's more so the efficiency behind it.
Now, Leo, you might have said this earlier, but how much time did you put into creating this TAS?
This TAS, I spent approximately, I want to say 100 to 110 hours.
That is phenomenal. That is a work of love.
Yeah, that was a span of about a month as well, so it was within a very short time period. It was essentially, I remember I had left my job and I decided to work on personal projects, including this one, and I streamed about 75 hours of this on Twitch. It's a not particularly enjoyable thing to watch because you're just sitting watching someone put inputs in, but there are definitely moments where everything sort of comes together that make it super satisfying. But yeah, it's the main problem with TAS runs is even once you sort of made it once, you have to go back and refine it, and that's usually where the problems come in. It's not figuring out how to do things efficiently, but how to do it as efficiently as possible, in a way. So this operation introduces burns, weirdly enough inside the throat, which is a bit weird. But that's a 3rd degree burn, and we're going to see here the TAS has to put these little grafts on, and it's going to do that for all 8 here, because 4 are required per thing, per burn, and just like that, the TAS is just already done. Human players will do the exact same process, but it's mostly utilizing the tool switching, making sure that you've used every tool as much as possible, which is a very common trend across the entire time you play a DS game, especially for these games.
So to say this is a passion project is probably an understatement, that you've poured your soul into doing this. Do you have, and I know you showed this earlier on day 1 with the bonus run, but you've created other TASs as well, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So this was the first TAS I ever made, this one we're watching here. I decided I wanted to create a TAS of one of the Trauma Center games. I've played all 5, I've speedrun all 5, and have a lot of experience with them, but I decided I wanted to see how fast they could be done. Now, we've seen Wii TASs, but the problem is those can't be developed very easily. There's no tools available. So I just decided I'll pick one of the DS games because BizHawk has TAS Studio available with it. So I picked this game because there's a bit more complexity to it, and also it's a bit more friendly in terms of gameplay. The first game, if anyone has played the first Trauma Center game, they will know it is a bit painful, to say the least. But yeah, so this is the first one I made. Then I made a TAS for the first game, Under the Knife. And then I made the X-Ops for this game as well. And that was all within the span of the last year.
Awesome.
We're going to have another spooky moment with the vitals here. So TAS injecting the exact amount it needs to cover how much damage is about to come in from all of these little cuts. And again, basically just flexing on human players by doing all of that in one go. Human players normally have to cut those bleeders out, drain it, suture it, and then worry about the stuffing of the liver in the middle with that fissure. But yeah, TAS just does it all in one go because it can. And you might have noticed that kind of the PGS was still there. So the main problem with PGS or post-kill syndrome is it stops you from injecting the stabilizer. And if you can't inject stabilizer, you can't keep the patient alive, generally speaking. But in this case, there are multiple stages to PGS. You have full stage PGS where you cannot inject stabilizer. And then once you've injected a minimum amount, what happens is it goes to 0%, where basically you have a timer until it starts to progress again. However, as that sort of ramps up, you can still inject the stabilizer, even though the purple clouding has sort of come back. But regardless, you can still inject, and it's not until you get that notification, that announcement from your assistant saying, toxicosis has occurred, that's when you need to worry about it. Now, Emilio, he's not doing too hot. So the guy we just operated on the last operation is also this guy here. We decided to do a liver transplant to him as his liver is just shot. It's not doing too great. So we're gonna work through him here and just basically put in his new liver. But there's a small problem. The liver we're putting into him isn't, it's not in the best shape either, unfortunately. And it is infected with noose. And essentially, what we'll very quickly see is that we need to get rid of these tumors. Now, if you saw the run from yesterday, the showcase from yesterday, you'll very quickly recognize these little spores. Unlike the X-Ops TAS, we can burst these. We don't care about meeting certain grade requirements. As long as the patient isn't dead, TAS doesn't care. So you're going to very quickly see here these tumors spawning in. TAS is just going to keep boosting, let them all burst, and keep going. And it's going to keep doing that for every single wave it can. But in certain instances, it is better for the TAS to extract the tumors. The reason being is because there is about I think a 6 to 10 frame window difference between boosting and extracting the tumors. So that the extraction of the tumors is faster than if you were to boost the vitals, especially with the damage coming in from the tumors themselves. But you can see there, TAS essentially abusing how many vitals per tumor it takes to extract it as fast as possible.
So, patient comfort be darned. Essentially, we're going to allow the explosive tumors to go off just to, get it done in the name of speed, right?
Exactly. There's a reason why we call this series Anime Malpractice Simulator.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. TAS sort of takes it to a new level, of course, with the fact that it can do it even faster. But even as in standard speedruns, we still sort of basically do the same. We will either not treat something or do things in a particular order and let the patient suffer for it. But they're fine. They're
still alive, right? That's all that matters.
They're all alive, and they got anesthesia, so they're fine. They're not feeling it.
I was laughing to myself in the background because I'm noticing as you get to the final stitching up of the patient, it's always bad. It's never a good quality stitch, and I just can't help but just laugh to myself and think there's this horrible stitch up after this amazing surgery is done, but hey, you know what? It's faster.
Exactly. So there's certain gradings, as you pointed out, to within the game on sort of basically tells you how well you're doing. Sutures performed by the TAS will always be cool because of the way it can achieve them. But bandages, you have to gel the bandage, like the sort of incision point first to disinfect it. If you just put the bandage on straight away, it's always going to be a bad. We do that as speedrunners as well. It's just faster. But yeah, it's a common trend across all the games. It wouldn't be a Trauma Center game without a little puzzle though, and TAS makes it look absurd. I think, I can't remember how many frames it takes per sort of action here. I think it's 3 to 4 frames with a 2-frame gap between inputs, and it results in an absurdly fast and no way to be replicated puzzle. So that's probably the fastest we'll ever see that puzzle. I have tried to make it faster, but the way that works under the hood is so difficult to actually make it work. For some reason, it uses the same tool to place the little puzzle pieces as well to rotate them. So as a casual standpoint, it's really awkward. You're trying to pick it up and it's just rotating, and then trying to get that in the TAS, it wouldn't sometimes turn it as you'd expect it to, which caused lots of problems. I remember trying to do that and sort of tearing my hair out, like, why isn't this working? But
so after this surgery, because I want to make sure you can talk about it and explain, but was that the most, I would not say annoying, but the most frustrating part of creating this particular run for the TAS?
I wouldn't say so. There's worse points later on. I'll explain as we get further along, but that was definitely more frustrating than most ops. This operation, we're doing surgery on live TV, which is very questionable. Honestly, there's some questionable things going on with these games. But again, you can see TAS just sort of sliding the camera around in very weird ways, moving it so that it can deal with these tumors and the mini tumors that spawn after they've been extracted. And again, trying to reduce how much blood spawns, but I mean, TAS makes it look absurdly fast. It's really like you're just watching a human player with the healing touch performing surgery, in a way. But yeah, so going back to your question about sort of which operation was the most frustrating, there were definitely moments in the late game, so the last two chapters, that I had to go back on and rework, because you'll notice we're running the game on normal, so every operation so far has been done on normal. But as a community, we allow for operations to be done on hard. So it's normal and above, essentially, is the way that you can sort of imagine it. And hard difficulty impacts how certain operations later on work. I won't give a spoiler quite yet, because the way the TAS does it is pretty absurd. But certain timers get reduced normally on hard. So that's a way that can speed up how it works. But as I mentioned about the RNG, it's called on the timestamp. So if you suddenly just save like 10 seconds from an improvement to an operation because you changed to hard, everything later on might break. Not necessarily, but it's very likely to. And it causes a lot of problems. But that operation was incredibly frustrating. It's memorably very awkward to try to get down. Now, this op, I think, is probably the best demonstration of TAS just flexing on us mere mortals. We have aneurysms here. Inject a thing, remove it, drain the blood, close it, and suture up the vessels here. And we've got these big ones, so you have to put in an artificial sort of connection. And I'll basically just let this op sort of explain for itself, as we also have camera movement. And TAS can do things basically off the edge of the screen. So it's placed itself very specifically right here to deal with these two large aneurysms. And then it's going to deal with these two extra ones. And I mean, the surgery is being basically done out of view at this point. So we got another healing touch segment. That one was not a butterfly due to it being scripted. But again, TAS just doing TAS things. When this was developed, this was probably one of the first operations where we kind of just went, this is not okay. This is disgustingly fast. Because those big tumors, those large aneurysms are really frustrating to suture.
I have to ask, have you or other people in the community tried to replicate what TAS has been able to do for this run? So, for example, like having those aneurysms on the very outskirt of the camera, I would be constantly selecting the tools and maybe making it extremely frustrating. But have you tried to, emulate that yourself?
Yeah, so one of the very interesting things is once the TAS was finished and sort of available to anybody and everybody to watch, I sort of started speedrunning the game again. I hadn't run the game in some months and decided I'd come back to it now with all this knowledge of seeing this game done absurdly fast. And yeah, so the main things that sort of we discovered is, at least I observed, is how early you can put the select input, which is basically to tell the game to skip the dialogue. You can put that in a lot earlier than you think, which just saves the guesswork of when you need to be hitting that button. But yeah, anything to do with camera angles, we have started to basically employ in terms of if you're confident enough and you can do it, putting them on the edge of the screen saves a lot of movement with that camera tool. And the way that the TAS actually operates behind the tools and how we can do it as players is you have to start operating in the main space, and then, for example, if you've got the scalpel, you can then cut around the aneurysm.
Your own surgical precision, if you would.
Yeah. Alright, this operation, TAS once again just demolishes, but for a different reason. So, this is the first instance that we've seen, at least in this game, where TAS skips entire gameplay segments. So here TAS is just cleaning up all this stuff, and you're going to hear Angie say, "Echo this." She said echo right there, where she expects you to use the ultrasound to find those hidden cuts again. But they hadn't spawned yet. TAS was so fast, it completely skipped that entire segment for the game to spawn those in. And from my understanding, the way the game works is essentially, because everything has to be cleared for you to exit out of the patient, if you are in a state where there is nothing to clean up and there is no scripted event or dialogue that would cause that to happen, the game will simply go, well, you finished the surgery, let's back out. And that's what happened there. We haven't been able to replicate that with human sort of inputs because, simply put, trying to achieve that level of speed is absurd. But it was a really kind of coincidental thing for the TAS, as when I was developing it, I just went, oh, wait, I thought there were hidden cuts here to deal with, and I didn't have to deal with it. So it's a lot of discoveries in this were essentially by pure coincidence for a lot of it. And that's what a lot of sort of TAS is going, what happens if we do this? Or, oh, we get this result because this happened. But TAS gives you those tools and that way to see what happens. And I think, for me personally, that's what made the TAS so interesting. It's not seeing the game done so efficiently or as fast as possible. It's actually the discoveries that come after it. Okay, this next op is 3 patients with the same thing, but it gets progressively more difficult. TAS doesn't care, and I'll try and do my best to explain. Actually, I'll let the TAS basically go over this first patient, because this is Kiriaki, little bats that got to be lasered. And you'll see very quickly TAS just cuts them out, lasers it, and it's done. Repeat that until they're all gone, and you're good. But the next patient will have an extra complication. This one goes with it, but you can see here TAS is sneaking. It's basically getting those sutures in between inputs, between those laser inputs, because the animations are long enough. And that's like a lot of TAS as well, of TAS development, doing things in a certain order. So we'll see here, this patient has the final Kiriaki, the larger one, isn't a standard one. It lays eggs, which is a bit weird to think about. But it means that if you don't remove them, you get those small little bats flying around as well. So TAS doesn't really care, it sort of does things in a very particular order. and then sutures everything up before it's actually finished the animation, which is what we actually try and do as human players. We'll see if we can sort of order things so that the animations are taking place, and instead of wasting time after the animation, we're doing it during. It's a very minor thing and hard to try and achieve normally though. So again, just lasering up these Kyriaki as they come along. This is again an instance where gameplay stages sort of stacked on top of each other. That immature that was there should have spawned in a previous wave, but we've observed that for standard speedruns that you can, if done at the right time, get those two to kind of combine. But it just means that the TAS can sort of tidy up everything super quick. That was sort of Kyriaki. That's the guild that you get introduced to in the first game, and it sort of resurges here with a complication. Nowhere near as common as the first game. Luckily, it doesn't happen quite as often, and we only see it a few times, which is a relief, because while it's a super fun and satisfying thing to watch for TAS, as a human player, it's a bit of a pain because of the way the mechanics work. I personally love Kyriaki, but only in the Wii variant of the first game. So moving already into chapter 4, and we're going to be essentially, Derek's going to have a bit of a problem. So I mentioned Emilio earlier. I specifically said his name. We did that transpond for him. He also had Kyriaki. The problem is we couldn't save him. There were just too many other patients. We couldn't save him, and he said, "Oh, I'll be fine. I got antibodies," which don't exist. So he died, and Derek is now blaming himself. And now he has to do a surgery, and we're going to do butterflies, and they're not working. That's not because the TAS is failing to draw a butterfly, it's because the game expects you to fail this operation. Hence why we got that message there, and we're now fading to black, but we haven't got this sad music. And we still even get a grade. But yeah, the game expects us to fail the operation there. And we'll have another failed op in a second as well. And I sort of made this joke with one of the other community members of Derek does this surgery, and then he leaves the OR, goes into a different operating room, and just gives up on the healing touch, all within a span of like 10 minutes. Canonically, it's probably closer to like an hour and a half, 2 hours from when he fails to, you know, whatever else. But it's a fun thought to think about, that he just walks into the other one and tries to draw more butterflies and gives up. Yeah, it's one of the few times where we'll see the medical board will be notified, even if you don't mess up an operation. This is sort of an intended fail, which is a bit confusing because you'd think you want to pass surgeries, but this is one of the, I think it's the only instances in the entire series where failed operations are a thing. I can't actually think of any other instances across the entire series where that's a thing.
I can't imagine that phone call when you go to actually talk to the board and go, well, there was a surgeon, and during the midst of the surgery, they just started drawing butterflies.
That's definitely a mental image I was not prepared for. Alright, so since Derek has forgotten how to draw stars, he's now having a huge mental block, and he's freaking out, and he's like, I don't know how to be a doctor anymore, I don't know how to do surgery anymore. And so he needs a bit of a slap in the face and a reminder, you can do surgery before you had the healing touch, so do it. And that's what this entire chapter is now about. It's Derek basically going back to his roots, to the first hospital he ever worked at, with his first assistant, which is Mary there, and she's going to be very chill and ask Derek to do some procedures. And the reason why I say she's very chill is because she suffers everything with Yo. So, drain Yo, echo Yo, and you'll see that very quickly as we get into this particular operation where we have to remove the gallbladder. There it is. This little skip there, you see the TAS cutting multiple segments before the blood appears, is possible RTA. It's a very difficult thing to do, but I have managed to achieve it once or twice. and it saves a few cutting inputs and sort of timing, but it's so tight, it's kind of almost, if you're trying to go for it, you can waste time by not doing it fast enough and then having to do extra work anyway. But it's a very minor thing. Again, TAS using each tool as much as possible before it moves on. Normally we wouldn't do that RTA. There's a bit of pus that normally spawns, so it's good to do things in a particular order to stop that from either happening or from doing it so that it doesn't cause a problem with you getting a miss. But thankfully, TAS is so fast, things become a non-issue. So going back to the whole thing of Derek no longer having his healing touch, we go on to, I think, this is one of the hardest operations RTA for the simple reason of the really low vitals, but also the last patient. And if anyone has played this game, they will very quickly understand why. Because trying to get an XS grade on this is absurd, and the TAS sort of makes this entire process look really easy. And this is the few times where we'll see the TAS also boost the vitals. It's going to keep them around the right kind of value, but you'll also see it's going to drop very, very quickly because there's a lot going on. I'm pretty sure these are from like accidents.
I've come to learn that anytime TAS is going to increase the vitals, that there is a world of hurt coming to the patient.
Oh, you'll very quickly see with this one. They've set to 34 exactly. And that's going to be important because they're already now down to 4. Very quickly ticking down. And it's not over yet. So yeah, patient's now at 0 vitals. Again, because that floating point precision means that they can be at 0 but still alive. And that's going to repeat again with the next patient, as there's a lot more to clean up.
This qualify as Derek creating zombies, perhaps?
You know what? Yes. That's the first take I've ever had on that, and I would agree with that. That's a good way to even think about it. The way we joke about it in the community is that it doesn't matter the patient's status as long as they're still alive, because it's for the ward to worry about after the surgery. So they might just be clinging to the lost strands of life, but the ward can worry about it. It's not a problem.
When they left my operating room, they were alive. I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's fine. Everything's fine.
Exactly. So this is the patient that causes everyone grief. It's because these little ligaments are about to appear. There you go. Have awkward hitboxes. They overlap a bit, and you've got to be super precise. Of course, TAS doesn't care. It's simply put, watching that back, I remember the reaction of one of our sort of top runners for this game. He was disgusted when he saw it. And that sort of applies to the entirety of this TAS. He saw multiple segments in development. He sort of watched and helped out and gave some pointers as I went, and just went, that's not okay. And that sort of always gave me a laugh, and I think always will. Like, retrospectively, when I look at parts of the TAS, I'm like, yeah, this is not okay. This should not be possible. But due to the fact that it's so accurate, it is. So Derek still hasn't got his healing touch, which comes into play for this op especially. Plot-wise, it's super important that he does not have his healing touch, because now he can't finish this surgery. And you'll very quickly see why. So Angie's dad, Blackwell, he has some tumors on his heart, and anything on the heart is bad. You know immediately it's game over. So we're gonna do this surgery real fast. Angie's telling us, quick, we're gonna go quick, let's save him. But Derek is gonna have a problem. So TAS is gonna open up the patient, and he's gonna clean up what he can, but he will have to back out. And this is another sort of weird instance where you don't finish the operation per se. So you can see these flashy tumors, drain on blue and cut out on blue, but don't touch when it's red. That's the rule here. And TAS doing things in order to optimize when it can do things. A super flashing tumor, and we can't touch that. It's red half the time. So we back out, suture up Blackwell, and Derek there in Japanese is basically saying, I'm useless. That did nothing. it was kind of amusing playing this because I was like, oh, this is a really hard op, and I've basically now got nowhere like progress-wise. And so it's then going to be compounded by the next operation we do is the same thing, but even harder. So if you struggle with that operation, this next operation is even harder, especially as you still don't have the healing touch. Basically, Angie and Blackwell and a whole bunch of his colleagues have a talk with Derek and be like, get a grip, essentially, is what they say to him. So he's going to do the surgery again.
Derek just keeps getting, hit down, knocked down over and over again.
There's a trend. Angie constantly just yells. So Angie is your assistant. Angie constantly just yells at Derek. And it's to the point where we as runners also just tell Angie to shut up because we don't care the fact the vitals are low or in her instructions. We already know how to play the game. But yeah, canonically, she is constantly berating Derek. And in the first game, that's how they sort of introduced, where Derek is a lazy surgeon who doesn't do his job properly. And Angie hates him for it. But TAS doesn't do that. TAS is too efficient. Anyway, vitals drop to 0 there for a brief moment, and again, they're going to drop very low. So finally we get the healing touch back. We're going to draw a butterfly and just boost the vitals up. Draw a little star with the sutures as we're waiting, and then recover those that last tumor out of the patient. TAS makes that look absurdly easy, but our main problem with this op is the order you do it in depends on how fast you are. So you might be able to do it one particular order, but it might be really slow. And as you get better at the game, you find you're just sitting there doing nothing. So you try and change the order, but it then gets stupidly hard again. It's a bit of a weird sort of way that the game works in that sense of this particular set of ops really requiring you to figure out what's the best order for you. Anyway, chapter 5. We're already a good portion of the way through. There's only 7 chapters to this game. But we're now at chapter 5, and we get introduced to the second antagonist. The first antagonist was that lady earlier on who was trying to tempt Derek before the puzzles. But yeah, so this is the second antagonist who he's going to do some stuff behind everyone's back and be like, haha, I'm doing good, but he's not. And so we very quickly have to clean up after him because he's caused some problems. But plot twist, one of the characters at the start of the game, Adel there, he was under Derek's wing until he got sick and Derek couldn't save him. And now Adel's mad at him, and so he leaves to join the antagonist's company to do surgery. The plot in these games is honestly wild. There is no way to feasibly explain them without either finding them absurd or going, what? Is the only reaction to have to it most of the time. But yeah, we get one of the kind of more interesting tumor operations to get introduced back now that we have got our healing touch back. TAS won't need it, but human players do utilize it, RTA, to sort of slow down cycles. But we have a small problem. The drain is going to break. So we have to do things in a very particular order so that if we still need the drain, we can use it when we need to. And then when we don't have the drain, we can still sort of do stuff. So TAS is going to get rid of these tumors real quick. You notice PGS is still active. It's then going to get a defib, so the vitals are nice and low, which is also not great. And we're going to deal with this tumor off screen essentially. And now we're going to inject the PGS syndrome to sort of reduce that DPS, because it's, for once, actually pretty important to keep the patient alive here while not having PGS active, because that does do a little bit of damage. See, you can see the TAS is utilizing the drain for its entirety. And the moment it removes the first tumor, that's when the drain's removed. Now, thankfully, it's basically done most of the operation, and now it just has to wait for that drain to come back for those few bits of blood. Human players basically can't really compete with that because of just the sheer timing between all of those things kind of lining up. You'll notice like the TAS had drained all of the tumors, cut one of the tumors out, and that's when the drain was removed. the tumors only stay in that drained state with the cutting lines around them for so long. So getting through 4 tumors like that, 4 or 5 tumors like that in a very short period of time is feasibly very difficult for human players to sort of achieve. But of course, TAS making it look easy. But the camera angle there I started to utilize myself, because it sort of makes it a little bit easier to work around certain areas of the organ when you can see everything essentially. If I remember right, this next operation is Tatati. It's a super boring operation in terms of content, because we basically play Simon Says with disease, which is not something I really expected to say at all in my lifetime until I started playing these games.
But here we are.
Yeah, here we are. So basically, we're gonna have these diverticular, kind of tumors that need removing. So we need to inject them with a specific color to sedate them. Then we can cut them out and go from there. And you'll very quickly see the things that make the tumors. You just have to inject the color that they are, and that's why I say it's Simon Says with disease, because it's essentially just a pretty straightforward process. And of course, because TAS can go super fast, it becomes a non-issue. So you see there's 3 colors. Thankfully it's only 3 colors at the moment, but it's then going to basically have the first syringe ready to go every time it comes to a cycle. Now if you watched the X-Ops TAS yesterday, you'll notice that a lot more was sort of done during the idle time. And the main reason for that is because that TAS was made afterwards. Once I sort of gained all of this knowledge and understanding of how to optimize a TAS, how to make it much more easy to work with, it made more sense to sort of add those extra things in. Unfortunately, looking back at this now, I'm like, there's so many wasted frames here that could be used for entertainment value. But fortunately, the op is so short, it's not really worth going back to work on. And it's one of those things that if or basically when the TAS is either picked up by myself again down the line or by somebody else in the community who wants to improve on it, they can make those changes themselves on the TAS, or see how it all fits together.
So speaking of TASs, or like you're noting, someone could come on in and help improve on this one. Do you have any future TAS projects that you're currently working on?
Not particularly, because I've worked through all of the 2DS games. It means that those are sort of done. There have been other tool-assisted speedruns made by others that aren't in the community or not actively in the community anymore. For example, there is a X-Ops no stabilizer TAS for the first DS game, Under the Knife. That was already made, and so I decided it's not worth me making another TAS of that category when somebody's already done it in a particular way. So it kind of meant that it was not worth me going down that avenue. So I haven't got any sort of current projects in terms of TAS. However, we would love to see a TAS of any of the Wii games made more recently, because in the last, I want to say, 1.5 to 2 years, a lot of changes in terms of how we play the Wii games has come about. But the main problem is we don't have the tools to make that, not easily. These games, because they're on Wii and DS, the DS has TAS Studio available for it in BizHall, but unfortunately the Wii games don't, and that's just to do with the way the architecture and how save states work in the Wii games via Dolphin just take up too much space. They're very encumbersome to sort of work with. In comparison, the DS games are very lightweight and very easy to work with. So this up, we've got a very tight time limit of 1 minute, which even casually is not really that stressful. But the game likes to point it out to you a lot, as it keeps telling you at the top of the screen, as well as low vitals. You might notice that blue line in the vital bar, that is the maximum vitals at that current time. So the vitals can't go above 10 in this operation. We're currently doing a heart massage. We're not doing a defib with with the paddles. Instead, 15. But instead, we're doing it's a heart massage to get that going, and that's used, I think, once more in this entire run. It's not something that comes up very often, which is thankful because it's very slow. You have to wait for those lines the circles to cross over, and then you tap on the screen and it massages the heart. Do that enough times and suddenly you are now able to continue the surgery. So this next operation is basically going to be working on the same guy, and to this time put in a pacemaker for him, as his heart isn't functioning properly after being shot. No surprise, really. So he's going to get a pacemaker put in, but there's going to be, of course, complications, because no surgery in this game is straightforward. Even in the start of the game, when the guy had a broken leg, it wasn't just pull out the bone fragments and put them back. No, it was, hey, there's some crocodile teeth in there. So you gotta keep an eye out for those. It's so many odd things about these games that when you actually give some thought to it, is raises lots of question marks. Okay, so we'll open up the patient again. This time we got much more vitals, but his heart will stop, so we'll have to do a massage again. You'll notice that Angie's saying a lot of the same instructions over and over. She gets very confused in this op. Even RTA. It becomes a running joke between me and I think the current world record holder. Just in English, she just says use the without any interruption at all. Like that. Obviously in Japanese it's a little bit different, but TAS sort of demonstrates just how condensed those voice lines can get. But yeah, she likes to repeat herself a lot in this operation for some reason.
So you were mentioning they were doing the heart massage that's there. Is that only available for those two operations, or is that something the player can do at other times if you're working on a heart?
So my understanding, it's only on these two operations in this game. It doesn't come up any other time. It's specifically just because you're working on the heart, and the defib either isn't suitable. It's just like a plot device essentially. The game chooses which way to resuscitate the patient you'd have to do.
Gotcha.
Alright, I'm going to now deeply apologize to anybody watching this right now, because the next operation is Pempty, or Pempty Plus, however you sort of want to interpret it, because it constantly has to be lasered. Now there's a small problem. The laser itself is a bit annoying. It's not too bad. But the problem is, it gets so much worse when you put it through an emulator and then export that like with the rendered frames, and then have to do additional work on the video to get it to display properly. So it ends up making the laser sound awful. That's just to do with the audio conversion. So I deeply apologize for the next like minute and a half of gameplay as you just hear a laser non-stop, because it's not great. So I'll kind of just try to talk over it. It's not quite as bad. But yeah, so Pempty, we've got to inject nanomachines into the core of it to make it exposed, because that's all covered in the first game for reasons. But basically it's even harder because there's now 2 cores. So we'll open up the patient here, inject those nanomachines from this like orangish vial into the circle, well, just about into that circle. The hitboxes are a little bit weird, and again, repeat that injection, and now we just laser it. And you can very quickly see why this lasering sound is awful. So what's going to happen is these 2 cores are going to split off, and you now have to laser each core until it's dead. The problem is if you have just 1 core left and it dies, it goes into a berserk mode, and that then unleashes loads of these mini cores. So the moment it's introducing us to these mini cores, we have the red cores which do lacerations, the blue ones which cause those small little tumors, and those grey ones that spin around. The TAS will basically remove them 90% of the time fast enough that they're not a problem, but its main priority is to laser these main cores. You can see they come back pretty frequently, but they will come back in the middle of these mini core spawning. It hasn't happened quite yet, just because of the way it all times out. But you'll see here, these tumor cores spawn in. Fortunately, TAS is so fast it can clean it all up. They can spawn in, and the TAS is going to focus the main core first, because the earlier you kill Empty, the essentially the better, because you finish the op as fast as possible. Casually, this can be kind of frustrating because you end up in what's called a cleanup loop. You can't progress the operation because you're not lasering the main core, because you're too busy cleaning up the mess it keeps making. And because it's on a cycle, it just sort of spirals out of control very quickly. So the top core is now dead, and we now need to finish off the bottom core. We're going to do that by lasering it, getting rid of these mini cores so there's no mess, and then killing it off and suturing up that laceration that appears. Super fast, and that's the exact same process we follow RTA as well. There's no real sort of anything special that the TAS is doing there. And that's enough of the laser for now, thankfully. We'll only get it in short little bursts later on.
So I might have missed something, but Angie's father, the one that had the issue with the heart, did we ever, or maybe spoiler alert, are we going to go back to save him, or was I just not paying attention? We already did that.
We did that. So there's two operations on Blackwell. The first one is Derek can't save him because he hasn't got his healing touch. The second time he has got his healing touch back, and we managed to treat that tumor. But the whole plot explanation was everyone's too far away. They can't help out. Derek has to do it, and so that's why he gets basically pressured into redoing the surgery. So we do save him, and he actually comes back later on as a little assistance. Because he was the bad guy in the first game, and now he's on our side, apparently.
Would you say that he had a change of heart then?
Oh, that I should have seen that one coming. But you know what? Leon, one of the TC runners, he will be proud. He regularly makes bad jokes at any chance he can get, especially when I do any kind of showcases or streams. He will just throw in bad jokes left, right, and center. So, you know what? I appreciate it.
I welcome the applause. I welcome the booze as well. It's perfectly fine. It's deserving.
Okay, so this one is post-treaty. Basically, there's some thorns that we need to pull out from this patient's stomach. They have PGS as well, but the TAS is just going to ignore it because it's not relevant to progressing the operation. But basically, got to drain out some stuff, cut out the thorn, and then grab it out and put a membrane on it. The gimmick, casually, is that you only have so much antibiotic gel. That's stuff that you affix the membrane with to make it sort of fade in and mend nicely. TAS doesn't care because it only puts as much as it needs. So making short work of just grabbing everything out very quickly. We get a second wave because, of course, ultrasound there because it progresses the game. But just like that, pulling all of those thorns out really fast and tidying up. Essentially, anywhere that the TAS can do a lot of one tool, it excels at.
Leo, please don't hate me for this one, but I have to say it. I feel like there's a missed opportunity here because you could do the healing touch and give this patient butterflies in their stomach.
You know what? I need to inform Leon of these jokes. He is missing out. These are great. Oh, there we go. I just saw he's heard it, so he loves it. Thankfully.
Thankfully, although again, Leo, if you were to hate me for it, I completely understand. But I couldn't just let that sit there.
Nah, that's an excellent joke. Once again, much appreciated. Of course, This game likes to throw things with a bit of a loop of you do the same thing. So, thankfully, there's only been a few instances where we have to redo the same thing over and over. But the game has to throw Pempty at us once again. Not Pempty, sorry, Tatati. We'll get Pempty later on. But Tatati again once more. So Simon Says with Disease. But this time we have 5 colors, which, funnily enough, can be a little bit awkward as a standard player. Like trying to remember which color goes to what, especially in such a short period of time, can be awkward. Usually it's not too bad, and the way I work around it is I pull one of the syringes first so I know exactly which color I've got and which one to track, and then the other 2 I sort of can remember with peripheral vision memory, so it's not quite so bad. But yeah, 4 colors, manageable. 5 colors, a little bit awkward. Fortunately, this op is very straightforward anyway, so it's not too much of a struggle. But the X-Ops has it much harder. TAS doesn't care though, because it's all predetermined. It can inject the exact color it needs and how much it needs. You'll notice it's only pulling like a very tiny amount of the syringe, and that's just all it needs to clear Tatati out.
And there's no particular order for which color you do first. It just seems to be as long as you match the right color.
That's correct. So it's like alternative name is Synchronized Venom. You just have to deal with it as a collective. If you only deal with one of them, it will just do the cycle again. So yeah, you just have to deal with all of them. There's no order to it. It's not like Noose, which has an order. The TAS will actually inject particular ones first. In the case of like saving 1 frame, it's a very minor thing, but I think sometimes in various occasions what happens is the Tatati spawns, but one of them might spawn a frame earlier than the others, so it means it can be injected slightly earlier. It's not something you'll ever notice RTA, and very much a TAS thing. But thankfully we'll see Tatati only 1 more time. I know, I wish I didn't have to see it again, but we'll see Tatati 1 last time later on. But the game's going to take a bit of a dark turn, but it's going to go somewhere a little bit weird, because Derek and Angie are going to get kidnapped. They're going to have to do surgery in a car for a guy who's broken his arm. I can't remember how he breaks his arm, but it happens, and they have to do surgery while in the car. Now, when they get kidnapped, it's dark. At least when they're in the car, it's dark. So they have to do surgery in a car while it's dark. And we have a bit of a running joke, because the gimmick for this is it's in the dark, so you have to shine the flashlight on the patient to sort of see what you're supposed to be doing. But the next funny thing is that because you're in the car, they have to sometimes turn around corners like that, and they'll do it again in the op to sort of demonstrate how that impacts your gameplay. TAS is so fast it doesn't matter, but for RTA, we actually try to get ahead of the cycle so that we don't get that turn, because if you complete the tidy up of the arm and reset it before the turn actually comes in, you can magically make this tunnel appear. It's incredible. So we're not actually going to see what TAS is doing. You're just going to see cool, okay, and things sort of appear on screen while it just very quickly tidies up what's going on here. Like that. It's all done.
Would we say that this qualifies as a blind speedrun for TAS?
Almost. I mean, realistically, the way that this is actually developed is essentially you play back and sort of see where things are. You get the locations for things, and then you remove the frames sort of between. So for example, you spawn into the operation, you load into the operation, like in that instance, I need to tell the TAS to grab fragments that I can't see. So what I can do is I can move the pen light, find out the X and Y coordinates of that bone fragment and where it needs to be pulled out to, and then remove the fragments remove the frames of me moving the pen light. So now it's just pulling the fragment out. And that's sort of how you sort of find out where things should be done in what order. It's kind of a very weird process to try and explain, but yeah, it's kind of blind. I mean, it's all predetermined anyway, so for the most part, it's all very consistent in that sense. I see a comment about it being a robot surgery in a way, basically. Though we actually did have an appendectomy earlier on, so if you missed that, you have to go back and see that. But basically, yeah, it's kind of, I guess, like robot surgery. The analogy we make is that we are watching a player who's playing with Healing Touch IRL. Anyway, we're doing surgery on a door. I kind of glossed over that, didn't I? The fact that that's happening. We're doing this operation on hard. It's the only op we do on hard because the timing is reduced between the light flashing. You can't grab a pin while it flashes. And this is, again, the positions are all predetermined, so TAS doesn't need to move the pen light around. But basically just grabs those pins, moves them straight up and places them onto the tray, and does it all before the light moves. You can see it does a weird sort of pan as it cuts out the door, essentially, to get the shell off, to get to the mechanism. And that's just basically, those points are all predetermined, and so it's just connecting the dots, which is super satisfying to watch when you just see that basically spiral around, especially in a pure black screen, essentially. But that was it. That was the door operation. Notoriously difficult casually, because if you grab a pin while it's flashing, that's it. You have to redo all 4 doors. That's also the only excess we're ever going to see on this particular TAS. So we go back to normal to continue with the rest of the game. The vital loss is too big on hard.
I do love that it did say the patient is saved for the door, so thankfully the door will be okay.
Yeah, the door will be okay, don't worry. If anyone was worrying, that's not the case, don't worry. But yeah, it's just like obviously the same splash screen. It's the same reason why the medical board will be notified about Derek's failure drawing stars, even though he's doing that privately to sort of test himself. I'm not sure why the medical board will be notified of that. But
ethical self-reporting, that's my guess.
Yeah, you know what? Turns out Derek is a good guy in that sense. So, we were kidnapped, we've now escaped by cutting through all the doors. And now it is time for us to basically save the bad guy. Which makes no sense realistically, but, you know, as doctors, we have to save anybody, regardless of who it is. We took an oath. So, we're going to help these children here who have guilt, as well as the father who has guilt as well. These are the bad guys. They've got guilt. They're the ones making guilt. This is like the 3rd antagonist now we've seen. This game has 3 antagonists. I never even realized, when actually thinking about it. It's kind of odd. But, yeah, basically, we have to deal with 3 different guilt patients that are generally harder than the last few we sort of dealt with. At least in terms of casually, it's just a bit more intense because you've got 3 patients back to back. They're all in the same operation.
And even above the ethical obligation to serve your patients no matter what, it is important to note that there are people with weapons that are probably, threatening Derek if he doesn't do the surgery.
Well, naturally, they're on Derek's side.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
Worse. So we're just helping the bad guy.
Basically, yeah, it's like, oh no, he's not doing too good. Let's save him, I guess. So, yeah, this will be, I think this is the last time we get to Tati. We don't see it anywhere else in the rest of the game. Very boring, Simon Says, once again, with colors and all weird bugs crawling around on Bolivia here. But once we get past Tati, we actually get some interesting Kiriaki gameplay again, where we utilize an interesting sort of quirk, where there's only so much memory in a DS. And so if you have too many cuts on screen or too many things going on, it just struggles. Either it can't spawn new things in, or you get some weird behavior that we observe in the first game. In this game, I mentioned about those eggs, and if they hatch by you lasering the Queen Kyriaki before removing them, what happens is that you get an extra immature. Now, TAS doesn't have to worry about that because the memory is all used up with these cuts coming up. You'll see the triple cut appears, this here. That is enough to prevent the queen from giving any more eggs off into the organ, which is really beneficial. We use that RTA as well. But essentially, as long as you remove those first 2 eggs, you have no more immatures or eggs to deal with while you then clean up. The main problem is you've now got really high DPS from all those cuts on screen. So it's a bit of a balancing act. And again, we now have Pempty, and I'm going to have to go over what's going on so we don't get the awful lasering sound. Now, thankfully, I think, if I remember right, I was a bit more considerate with the laser. This is like, when I realized the second off, I was like, maybe I don't need to laser all the time. And we actually get some interesting tool nonsense as well, I think. This is sort of where it first developed. So it's still not great. Unfortunately, I was very mindful for the XOps TAS to remove this awful sound as much as possible, because realistically, all these extra frames of it just lasering isn't necessary, but there is a weird interaction with how the laser damage is applied. If the laser's already been running for a few frames, it applies the damage instantly. If it has to warm up a bit, so if you're going from no inputs with the laser to trying to laser something, it doesn't deal that damage instantly. It takes extra frames to achieve that. So the main reason here was we were trying to basically reduce that problem of not lasering something as only possible. I found other ways of working around it, thankfully, for the XOps TAS, and this is one of the few ops that would need improvement down the line if it was to be remade, as, simply put, this noise is awful. But once again, it's basically just going to laser these main cores and clean it up as early as possible, and then finally deal with the sort of the berserk core, as we call it. You'll notice the TAS does alternate between which cores, and here's the tool nonsense with a little tool roulette.
What I hear, Leo, is that there's an opportunity for someone to make a mod for this game that can replace the laser noise for something a lot more interesting or funny.
Very possibly. We know that texture and asset swaps can be done for the Wii games. For the DS games, I don't think anyone's spent the time to sort of either, I'm not sure, decompile, because these games, the language they're written in is awful, simply put. The Wii games are written in PowerPC, so trying to work with that is awful, and this, I think, is written in ARM, either ARM 7 or ARM 9. So it also is very awkward. No one's really spent the time trying to decompile it yet. Whether we could do an asset swap might be possible, but that would be kind of limited to emulator. But it would certainly improve things if we didn't have that awful sound. Like I mentioned, it's only a problem with the TAS, unfortunately. In actual consoles, it's nowhere near as piercingly bad. It's just to do with the way that everything gets encoded. Anyway, we're in the last chapter now, which is kind of wild. Think about the fact that it's in the last segment of the game now. So we have to deal with two more types of Neo Guilt or Guilt. This one is Bythos, is the last sort of conventional one we're going to get, where it's going to basically have these lacerations. We're going to suture them all up real fast, and then we're going to have this convulsion, and here we see Bythos spawns. And it's got this eye in the middle. Basically, we need to laser that, and the exact X and Y coordinates make such a big difference on how effective the laser is here. But basically, TAS is just going to keep lasering it, remove the core, and you can see that core just sort of disappears instantly. It's the same with glass fragments. It's because it can move something from an X and Y coordinate to another in one frame. but it's like that's dead. Well, so fortunately, this is sort of the introductory to Vythos. It's a lot easier to deal with, and this is, I think, I'm not too sure if the TAS was the reason, but we figured that doing this without healing touch could actually save quite a bit of time, because you saw those animations where basically you remove the core, that eye, and then Python has to sort of shut on itself again. It has to fuse back together. That takes a really long time if you don't do that. If you do that with the healing touch. So it ends up being this awful, really long animation. So we have to be kind of mindful of doing that with the healing touch. But TAS can bypass all those problems. And even now, I think most RTA players, if they can, will do that up without HT, just to save on those animation times. But moving on from Bythos, we get some aneurysms again. This time they're on the brain, so this is a big deal. We now have 3 patients of these, and this op is what can only be described as a wrist demolisher, because of how intense it is on your wrists. You spend this split, I think, for me on average, is about 8 to 9 minutes. For other players, it's probably a bit faster, as I'm not the fastest, admittedly. But in general, this op is just very intense. That's because you have 3 patients, and they all have aneurysms that require suturing, draining, all of these kind of awkward tool switches over and over. So the first patient has the simplest procedure, second patient gets harder, third patient is the hardest. So this one just had aneurysms. Nice basic single point aneurysms that are super easy to deal with. You can see TAS just cleaning up. It's then going to keep going. It hasn't sutured yet. Now I'll suture because of the tool switching. And again, very careful placement and cutting out everything. We actually kind of utilized some of these angles, and TAS really showed us where certain things are in this operation and how you can line things up and which orders might work. At least I found, for me, I was like, oh, so that tumor is a lot closer than you think it is. Like, because of the camera tool and the way it works, it's very easy to sort of lose track almost of where things are, especially on the brain where there's no reference points realistically. So again, TAS is going to line itself up. It's going to get these 2 big aneurysms again. Getting that RTA very hard because the timer on when the serum wears off is really tight. This is the last patient, and it's now got pus and tumors to deal with. So you can see this tumor has now been exposed, and everything is done in a way that it optimizes each tool as much as possible. Healing touch is not being used, but we are utilizing some very kind of crazy camera angles here in these 2 aneurysms as well, suturing it all up, and then dealing with the last few bits on the left side of the brain before we move on to the final wave per se. And you can see basically everything's going to be done in this area with a little bit done on the right. You can see there's an aneurysm that can't be dealt with. It's just too far over, unfortunately, so it's going to be dealt with now, as well as that tumor. But this op being done in 1.5 minutes IGT is, by everyone in the community standards, just absurd. It's basically not achievable even with the healing touch. As for me personally, I got like a 5-minute remaining. About some of the other top players.
Like you were saying, Leo, it's one of those, spots where it feels like it's not fair.
Basically, and we get a lot of those for the next few operations. As we get Sigi here, it's another Neo-Guilt. And essentially you have to blow into the microphone. I was just kidding. Physically with the DS, you have to blow into the microphone to make the gas cloud go away. So for us speedrunners, we're either sitting there making a really loud noise, and then some just sort of basically just not yell, but almost close to that. For me personally, I just blow into the mic. It's enough for it to register as what I'm after. But it's that same thing of basically you're now having to blow into the microphone and do surgery real fast and multitask. It's very awkward. And then you now have to worry about how much you're blowing into the microphone and whether you still got enough breath to finish, and if you're streaming it, you then have to talk as well. It's an awful operation for that sense of just too much going on. TAS, of course, can just put an input into the microphone at maximum volume that it's expecting, and that's all it has to do. So, Siggy will spawn in here, and very quickly you're going to see we're not going to really see much of Siggy, because the gas card appears, and then before anything is really done with it, TAS is going to gel it and cut it. And we're going to have the same thing again here, where we basically spend most of the op not actually be able to see what's going on. And that's because while this gas card is up, you can still work on what's going on underneath. And there is one little trick that TAS is doing. The first few frames that you're able to actually interact with CE after the gas card's been blown away, you can cut pretty wildly anywhere, and you'll still hit CE. It might be the fake core, and it's kind of a scary thing to do, but it's still possible to hit the core regardless of whether you fully sort of actually gelled it and cut it. It's a very weird, I guess, function of how that works.
Out of curiosity, Leo, knowing that you can work on the patient under the gas, was that something that you think was found prior to, or is this like a really curious finding from TAS that you could still work on the patient even obscured by the gas?
That was already known on the fact you can clear up stuff while the gas is still there. It was more specifically the fact that you can operate on Siggy and cut it before the gas is fully gone. There's a French runner who he recently sort of looked into this a lot more and sort of rediscovered that process that I found, but he actually started doing an RTA and sort of seeing how viable it was, and he even did a whole bunch of investigation and sort of showed it's possible, but it's risky as all hell, but it ends up being a very kind of rewarding process if you can get it. Anyway, we're on the last 3 operations. So this one is 3 patients with burns. I'm just going to let the TAS speak for itself, because this is one of the moments where, simply put, it's satisfying and cathartic just to watch everything perfectly happen. So we got one last patient here. So TAS uses each tool as much as possible, as mentioned previously, but it can do some interesting cutting patterns. You'll notice that the scalpel was basically going across the entire screen with those red lines, which is very fun to also watch because it doesn't cut the patient, and it also does no extra vital damage. So TAS basically can just clean up everything all at once because the timers are irrelevant. RTA, that's a very difficult op of getting it all down. Getting the tool switching and the timing of everything, it's so tight. We got one last operation of Bifos before we move on to the final boss. The final boss is actually really stressful RTA, and even TAS has a lot of work to try and get things just right, make sure it goes as fast as possible, and TAS is almost too efficient for its own benefit, so it ends up basically having to wait a lot, and we'll see that when we get to the final boss. But we've got Bifos once more, so just lasering stuff, suturing up stuff as it sees fit, and then grabbing that core super quick. An interesting sort of bit of information is that for Bifos RTA, the way we extract that core safely, without touching those spores that fly around, we use 2 styluses. Well, we grab it for one stylus, we put down the second stylus, and it averages between the 2, and then we lift up on the first stylus, and basically it teleports. TAS does a very similar thing, but it's frame perfect, so it ends up, you don't see that sort of transition time, but that's how we do it RTA, and how we can do this off much quicker. So there's currently 4 lacerations on screen. No more can be made, even if Vitals attacks. Fortunately it didn't, and TAS just cleans up before the animation's finished. So within 30 seconds that patient's saved, which is pretty absurd. But that was the last, I guess, more normal operation, even if it is a Neo Guild. And we move on to the final boss, the final Neo Guild, which is Alethea. And this boss is basically an amalgamation of each of the previous guild types. So each stage we're going to be presented with a guild that we have to clear, and then we have to inject some serum into the eye that's in the center. Do that enough times and you can do some actual damage to it. Do that enough times and you'll then be able to actually clear out the boss for good. But this is a very sketchy last operation because of how all the timings work out. There are some wires that need to be cut, some blood vessels that need to be cut. If they are red, the patient dies. Or at least they'll take a lot of damage and you waste a lot of time. And if the patient's vitals are too low, then they die. Of course, TAS isn't going to run into that problem, but human players stress out a lot over this because it's so precise.
So would you say this is the most difficult surgery in the entire game for someone doing, an RTA or a regular run on it?
Yes, I would say this is one of the hardest operations, down to a kind of multitude of factors. It's very technical, very difficult. There's a lot going on, but also this is the last stop of the run. You've been playing this game for, an hour 45, hour 50, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, depending on how long your run is. And you're sitting there kind of like, this is the last stop. This is it before a PB or a record or whatever. And it's super easy to let that tension rise up and for you to choke. So we're going to very quickly see TAS is going to laser these guilts. And then it's going to inject twice. That's not normally possible RTA. It's very difficult to achieve that. And you can see the syringe is also nearly burned out. So it's going to have to be very careful. Thankfully it doesn't matter here. But it causes problems later on where the TAS is too efficient for its own good. Here's what I mentioned about it cutting wires. And I believe that this wire cutting order could actually be improved quite a bit with more discovery from the French runner previously mentioned. But you can see here, basically it's each of these. This is Sigi, where you have to gel it and then cut it. TAS is just basically getting rid of them, even though it has no syringe. Repeating that process of injecting and then cutting the wires once more, and we'll get one more phase after this. This skips a very large amount of this final boss, because if you fail a segment, or if you don't inject enough, you move on to the next guild type, and miss enough guild types, or move on to the next wave too many times, and it becomes incredibly difficult. Luckily, us speedrunners have methods to get around that, and the TAS employs the same process. So we've got 2 lacerations there, clean those up. And then TAS is then going to do the last little bits of damage. Time is when the credits appear, so we've still got a little bit, and I'll count that in. But this is the last set of hits here, so cutting through each of those wires. And now we have one last bit, one last butterfly in the heart. You can see those wires spin around. And we're going to cut these in a very specific order. You can see it didn't fully cut that wire, and that's because it's going to use that wire later on to basically cut the final wire without having to wait. And this is what we do as RTA players as well. You see the last wire now. And there Derek saying he is a doctor in Japanese. And of course, in real TAS fashion, we finish on 0 vitals.
Beautiful.
Wouldn't have it any other way. So that's Alethea dead. Get the suture and we grab the bandage. And this is another thing that we discovered. You can grab the bandages from Angie before she talks. It's a very small bit of time save, but very unique. But that was the last operation. Alethea is now dead, and we then move on to the credits. So time will be coming up in just a moment. We open up this episode, so that will be in 3, 2, 1, and time.
GG Taz, GG Leo. Awesome job.
Yeah, as I mentioned, this is the first TAS I ever made, so it was a lot of time spent was just learning how to do a TAS in the first place, the tools behind it, and how to sort of make it all work. But yeah, it was watching back at it, it's always going to be, I think, be one of the highlights of any TAS that I ever watched, because obviously I worked on it, but also all of the work that I did to basically make it go.
Like I said, Leo, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to see this passion project of yours. It's very clear that you put a lot of time and effort into this, and I really just respect your craft that you have here and your time joining us. Do you have any other shout outs that you'd like to give before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I'll quickly just thank there's a few members of the Trauma Sonic community who helped me originally work on this, Thurla being one of them. He's a very technical, very knowledgeable guy who was able to sort of help me figure out how the RNG thing works in the back end and whatever else. So super knowledgeable. I really appreciate him putting in all the work that he did. And then Leon for basically sticking through me making this TAS, keeping me entertained, because working on a project for 100 hours, you start to lose it a little bit after a while. So having somebody else about makes it so much more bearable. But yeah, if you want to see these TASs, they're available as well on YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Leo Kedron for that surgically precise TAS run of Under the Knife 2. If you're not already, please give Leo a follow by scrolling down under the stream title and click Leo's user tag to quickly give them a follow. We're going to be taking a quick break as we set up for our next run, the last run of the event, so relax, enjoy some more tunes, and don't touch that dial, because Pixel Perfect Marathon 3